What happens when a woman who has been called a traitor and a hero, a sex symbol and a revolutionary, a Hollywood princess and a radical activist, sits down for what should be a celebration of her remarkable life, only to have the most painful chapter of her history thrown in her face like a weapon? What you're about to witness is one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on daytime television. The moment when Jane Fonda, the legendary actress who has faced down presidents, protesters, and her own inner demons, reminded the world that 8 decades of living don't make you softer, they make you dangerous. The studio went dead silent, the audience held their breath, and Joy Behar discovered that some women have been fighting for so long that one more battle is nothing but a warm-up. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because trust me, you're gonna want to talk about this one. The morning had started with a sense of anticipation at the View Studios. Jane Fonda was coming on the show, and everyone knew that meant the interview could go anywhere. At 87 years old, Jane remained one of the most fascinating and polarizing figures in American culture. A woman whose life had spanned old Hollywood glamour, political radicalism, fitness empire building, and a late career renaissance that had earned her entirely new generations of admirers and critics alike. Jane arrived at the studio with the energy of someone half her age, dressed elegantly. Her silver hair was styled simply, her posture still commanding, her eyes still carrying that famous intensity that had made her a star in Barbarella and won her 2 Academy Awards. She had come to promote her latest project and discuss her ongoing environmental work, but she was prepared for harder questions. She had been facing hard questions since before most of the production staff was born. In the green room, her team reviewed the potential difficult topics, but Jane waved them off with a knowing smile that carried 60 years of experience. She had been called every name imaginable, had weathered controversies that would have destroyed lesser careers a dozen times over, and had emerged from each one still standing, still fighting, still magnificently herself. What nobody anticipated was that Joy Behar had arrived that morning, determined to relitigate every controversial moment of Jane's extraordinary existence. The studio lights were warm as Jane took her seat at the famous table. She greeted each host with genuine warmth, her famous smile lighting up the space in a way that reminded everyone why she had been captivating audiences for 6 decades. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute, a testament to the complicated fascination she still inspired in people across all generations and political persuasions. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with obvious respect and admiration. Our next guest is truly one of a kind. 2 Academy Awards, 7 nominations, a lifetime of activism that's inspired and infuriated in equal measure, and a career that spans over 60 years. Please welcome the legendary Jane Fonda. The applause continued as Jane settled into her chair with practiced elegance. Thank you so much. What a wonderful audience. I've always admired this show for not shying away from difficult conversations. So it's a pleasure to finally be here with all of you. Sarah Haynes asked about her latest project, and Jane spoke passionately about the film, about the younger actors she had mentored, about the sheer joy of still being able to practice her craft. At an age when society expected her to be invisible, she was articulate and engaging, shifting easily between serious reflection and self-deprecating wit. You know, when I was young, I thought by 87 I'd be sitting in a rocking chair somewhere, knitting and being quiet, Jane said with a warm laugh. Instead, I'm getting arrested at climate protests, making movies, and apparently still making people angry just by existing. Life really does have a way of surprising you if you refuse to give up on it. The audience laughed appreciatively. This was the Jane Fonda they had come to see, vibrant and sharp and utterly unapologetic about living fully at any age. For a few minutes, everything felt warm and celebratory. Then Joy Behar leaned forward with that familiar predatory glint in her eyes, and the energy in the room shifted dramatically. So, Jane, Joy began, her voice carrying an edge that made the other hosts exchange nervous glances. You've had quite a life. Movies, marriages, activism, controversy. But there's one thing that I think we need to address head on, because a lot of Americans have never forgiven you for it, and never will. Hanoi Jane. The trip to North Vietnam during the war. The photograph sitting on that anti-aircraft gun used to shoot down American planes. 50 years later, do you finally understand why so many people, especially our veterans, consider what you did to be absolutely unforgivable. The question landed like a bomb in the middle of the studio. The audience went completely silent. The other hosts looked stunned by the directness and hostility of the attack. Jane's expression remained composed, but those who knew her well could see a subtle shift behind her eyes. A gathering of energy that suggested she was preparing for a fight she had fought 1,000 times before. "Joy, I've addressed this many, many times over the past 50 years, Jane replied, her voice steady, but carrying an undertone of weariness. The photograph was a terrible mistake. I've apologized for it more times than I can count. I was manipulated into that situation by handlers, but I take full responsibility for not being more aware of how it would be used as propaganda. However, I will not apologize for opposing a war that cost 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. History has proven that opposition was correct." Joy wasn't satisfied. She leaned in closer, sensing she had found a weak point to exploit. "That's a very convenient way to reframe history. You didn't just oppose the war like millions of other Americans. You went to enemy territory during wartime. You made propaganda broadcasts that were played to American POWs. You called American prisoners liars when they reported being tortured by their captors. How do you explain that to the Gold Star families, the men who never came home?" The accusation was sharp and personal, designed to wound as deeply as possible. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sunny Hostin looked like she wanted to intervene immediately. Jane's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been the accumulated pain of 50 years of answering this exact question. "I never called POWs liars," Jane said firmly, her voice gaining an edge. "That is a distortion of what I said that has been repeated so many times it's taken on a life of its own. But it's simply not true. I questioned the Nixon administration's political use of POW stories for propaganda purposes. That's entirely different. And as for the broadcasts, I spoke about what I had seen with my own eyes. American bombs falling on hospitals, on schools, on dikes that protected farmland and civilian villages. Those were documented facts, Joy. Inconvenient facts that the American government didn't want the American people to hear. Facts from the North Vietnamese perspective," Joy shot back with a smug expression. "You were being used as a propaganda tool by a communist regime that was killing American soldiers, and you were either too naive to see it or too arrogant to care about the consequences. Which was it, Jane?" The question was designed to corner her, to force her into admitting either stupidity or malice. But Jane Fonda had been facing this exact trap for half a century, and she wasn't about to be cornered now. "I was 34 years old, Joy. I was passionate and angry about a war that was killing people I knew personally, that was tearing this country apart at the seams. Did I make mistakes in how I expressed that opposition? Absolutely. Was I naive about how my actions would be perceived and weaponized? Yes, I admit that freely. But here's what I won't do. Not for you, not for anyone. I won't pretend that the war itself wasn't a catastrophic moral failure. I won't pretend that the men who orchestrated it weren't the real villains. I won't pretend that opposing mass death was somehow a betrayal of American values." She leaned forward, her intensity filling the space between them like an electrical charge. "And I won't be lectured about patriotism by people who think loving your country means never questioning it, never challenging it, never demanding it live up to its ideals. I've spent 60 years fighting for what I believe is best for America. Climate action, women's rights, voting rights, veterans' rights, by the way. Something I've worked on extensively since the war ended. So, before you reduce my entire 8-decade existence to one photograph taken 50 years ago, maybe consider the totality of what I've actually done with my life. The counterattack was powerful and articulate, delivered with the precision of someone who had honed these arguments through thousands of similar confrontations. But Joy wasn't ready to surrender the offensive. "That's a lovely speech, Jane, very polished. But let's talk about the totality of your life, since you brought it up so proudly. 3 marriages, all failed. A fitness empire built on making women feel inadequate about their bodies, pushing impossible standards. A career that's been as much about who you married, who you slept with, who your famous father was, as any actual talent. And now you're the face of climate activism, while flying around on private jets and living in multiple mansions. Don't you think there's something deeply hypocritical about all of that? The attack was breathtaking in its scope and viciousness, hitting Jane's personal life, her business ventures, her talent, and her activism all at once. Several audience members gasped audibly. Even Whoopi's expression had hardened noticeably at the cruelty of Joy's comprehensive assault. Jane sat very still for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried a steel that made everyone in the studio lean forward to listen. Let me address each of those points individually, since you've decided to make this deeply personal. Her eyes locked on Joy's face with an intensity that made the host shift uncomfortably in her chair. My marriages. Yes, I've been married 3 times. To Roger Vadim, who helped me discover my own sexuality and power as an actress when the industry wanted me to be nothing but Henry Fonda's pretty daughter. To Tom Hayden, with whom I spent 17 years fighting for social justice and raising 2 wonderful children who I'm immensely proud of. To Ted Turner, with whom I learned about business and media and global thinking, and ultimately about my own deep need for independence and autonomy. She paused, her voice gaining a sharp edge. Each of those relationships taught me something essential about myself and about life. I don't consider them failures. I consider them chapters in a very long, very full book. The only failure would have been staying in situations that weren't working out of fear of what people like you might say about me. Her gaze intensified as she continued. My fitness empire. I created those workout videos after spending years recovering from bulimia and body dysmorphia, eating disorders I struggled with for 3 decades. I created them specifically to help women feel strong, not skinny, strong. The fact that you would characterize that work as making women feel bad about their bodies shows how profoundly you've misunderstood what I was trying to accomplish. Those videos helped millions of women around the world take control of their physical health. I still receive letters from them today, 40 years later. Her voice dropped to something more dangerous, more controlled. As for my career being built on who I married or who my father was, I have 2 Academy Awards, Joy, 7 nominations, a career spanning 60 years with performances that are studied in acting schools around the world to this day. I was one of the first actresses in Hollywood history to demand equal pay and meaningful creative control over my projects. I produced my own films when no studio would give women those opportunities. So please enlighten me further about how my career was built on anything other than talent, discipline, and extremely hard work against tremendous odds. The audience had begun to murmur with approval, but Jane was far from finished. And finally, the hypocrisy charge, the favorite weapon of people who want to silence anyone advocating for change. Yes, I live comfortably. I've earned that comfort over 60 years of work that has generated billions of dollars in economic activity. But I also give away the vast majority of my income to causes I believe in. I've been arrested 5 times in the past few years, alone protesting for climate action, spending nights in jail cells at 80+ years old. I've put my body on the line for my beliefs at an age when most people are sitting comfortably at home, criticizing others from the safety of their couches. She turned to look directly at the audience, then back at Joy, with an expression that could only be described as withering. I don't claim to be perfect. I don't claim to have all the answers. I don't claim my lifestyle is beyond criticism. But I absolutely claim the right to keep fighting for what I believe in. And I will not be shamed into silence by someone who has never risked anything meaningful for any cause in her entire comfortable life. The accusation landed with devastating precision. Joy's face flushed a deep red. I've taken plenty of risks on this show over the years, Joy protested, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence and edge. Have you really? Jane's smile was thin and carried absolutely no warmth. What risks exactly? That some viewers might disagree with your hot takes? That you might receive some angry tweets from strangers? I've had credible death threats for 50 years, Joy. I've been hanged in effigy by mobs. I've had my films boycotted by entire states. I've had my patriotism and my humanity questioned by people who have never served anything larger than their own egos and bank accounts. That's actual risk. Sitting at a comfortable table and offering safe opinions to people who already agree with you is not risk. It's a very well-paying job. The distinction was so clear and so cutting that Joy seemed momentarily unable to formulate any response. You want to talk about my life? Jane continued, her voice rising with decades of accumulated fire. Fine, let's talk about all of it, the full picture you seem so eager to paint. Let's talk about growing up with a father who couldn't express love, who was so emotionally unavailable that I spent decades in therapy trying to understand why I never felt good enough for him, even when I won Oscars. Let's talk about my mother's suicide when I was 12 years old, and how that trauma shaped everything that came after. Let's talk about struggling with eating disorders and crippling self-hatred for 30 years before I finally learned to accept and love myself. She stood up, her 87-year-old frame somehow commanding the entire studio with the same presence that had made her a movie star 60 years earlier. Let's talk about being blacklisted in Hollywood, about watching my career nearly destroyed because I dared to have political opinions while female. Let's talk about rebuilding from nothing, about finding new ways to be relevant and useful, about refusing to disappear into comfortable obscurity just because some people desperately wished I would. That's my life, Joy. Not the simplified, scandalous, easy-to-mock version you want to present for entertainment. The real, messy, complicated, painful, triumphant life of a woman who has never stopped fighting for what she believes in. Joy attempted to regain control of the conversation. I'm just asking the hard questions that a lot of regular Americans want answered honestly. You've been an incredibly controversial figure for decades. Don't you think people have a right to hold you accountable? Accountable for what exactly? Jane's voice was sharp as a blade. For opposing a war that killed millions of innocent people. For advocating for women's rights before it was fashionable or safe. For warning about climate change when politicians were still calling it a hoax invented by the Chinese. History has vindicated virtually every major position I've taken over 60 years. The Vietnam War was wrong. Women deserve full equality. The planet is literally burning. I've been on the right side of these issues my entire adult life. What exactly should I be held accountable for? Being right before it was convenient? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jane cut her off before she could speak. I'll tell you what I think this is really about, Joy. I think I make you deeply uncomfortable. I think women like me, women who refuse to be quiet and agreeable, who refuse to age gracefully and disappear into irrelevance, who keep fighting and speaking and making noise decade after decade, we make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Because we're living reminders that you don't have to accept the limits society puts on you. You don't have to shut up and go away just because someone in authority thinks you should. She looked around the studio, her gaze taking in the audience, the hosts, the cameras capturing every moment for posterity. I'm 87 years old. I've survived cancer and chemotherapy. I've survived public humiliation on a scale most people can't imagine. I've survived being called a traitor by people who never put on a uniform but wrap themselves in the flag whenever it's convenient. I've survived everything this culture has thrown at me for 6 decades, and I'm still here. Still working, still fighting, still refusing to be silenced by people who think their personal discomfort with my choices gives them the right to judge my entire existence. She turned back to Joy, and her voice dropped to something quieter, but somehow far more powerful. So here's my question for you, Joy, and I want you to really think about it. When you're 87 years old, what will you have fought for? What will you have risked? What will you be able to point to and say, I made a real difference in the world? Because I know exactly what my answer is. I know what I've contributed, what I've sacrificed, what I've built over 87 years. Can you honestly say the same about yourself? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Joy sat in complete silence, unable or unwilling to formulate any response. Jane gathered her things with the quiet dignity of a woman who had walked off countless stages in her extraordinary life. I came here today hoping to have a real conversation about the important work I'm still doing, the causes I still believe in passionately, the life I'm still living fully at 87. Instead, I've been subjected to a hostile rehash of every controversy from the last 50 years by someone who seems more interested in tearing down than building anything up. She looked at Joy one final time, and her expression carried something unexpected, compassion. I forgive you for this, Joy. I've had to learn forgiveness over the years because holding on to anger only poisons your own soul in the end. But I want you to think about something long after this interview is over. In 50 years, when people look back at this moment, what do you want them to see? A journalist asking genuinely hard questions? Or a woman trying to destroy another woman for the unforgivable crime of living a big, complicated, meaningful, consequential life. She paused at the edge of the stage before delivering her final words. "I've made peace with my past, all of it. The terrible mistakes, the glorious triumphs, the endless controversies, the constant reinventions. It's all part of who I am, and I wouldn't change a single chapter. I hope someday you can find that kind of peace with yourself and your own choices, because people who are truly at peace with themselves don't feel the overwhelming need to tear others down the way you've tried to tear me down today." With that, Jane Fonda walked off the stage with the same grace and determination that had carried her through 6 decades of Hollywood and 60 years of activism. The audience erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the walls. The remaining hosts sat in various states of shock and admiration, and Joy Behar remained at the table, looking somehow smaller than she had when the interview began, like someone who had just learned a very difficult lesson about picking fights with legends. What had started as a promotional appearance had become something far more significant. A woman who had been fighting since before most of the audience was born had shown that the fire never goes out in certain souls. It only burns cleaner, hotter, more focused with each passing year. And she had reminded everyone watching that a life fully lived, with all its mistakes and contradictions and glorious complications, will always be infinitely more powerful than a life spent safely judging others from the sidelines. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Joy Behar out of line, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.